Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dave Olson. I'm the chair of the American Chamber of Commerce in Canada, and it's my privilege to kick things off today. For those who aren't familiar with the American Chamber of Commerce, we're the voice of U.S. business in Canada, and we think it's especially important to get out quickly to share what we know and what we suspect could happen during this tumultuous time in the Canada-U.S. trade relationship. Thanks for tuning in today. This session is being recorded and will be posted and available on the AmCham Canada website for your review later this week. Thanks to our amazing panel for taking the time to update the group in our responding to reality and reactions to week one of the new Trump administration. We're privileged to be joined today by Dan Utso. Dan is a trade lawyer with Thompson Hine and one of the most knowledgeable people on what is happening in the US right now, as well as likely next steps, strategy, and timing. We also have Hannah Thibodeau, who is the Executive Communications Officer for Global Public Affairs and an award-winning journalist who covered Parliament Hill for CBC News. And finally, we have Andrea Van Voot. Andrea is the COO for Wellington Advocacy and the National Strategy Director for AmCham Canada. She was also the foreign policy and trade advisor to the Harper administration. Our goal today is to provide a really good backdrop of what's happening, what we know right now over the first 30 minutes, and then to take questions and answers during the second half of our discussion. Please submit any questions you have through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Submit them as quickly as you can, and we'll do our best to sort through, consolidate, and present answers to those questions during the second half of our webinar today. And now, on to our speakers. I'll hand the microphone over to Dan Utso. Dan, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thanks, Dave. And as always, thank you to AmCham Canada for having us on. I'll take the introduction. It was very generous and nice, but let me set expectations appropriately. Nobody really knows what's happening next in the United States except for a handful of people that are either in Washington or gathered down in Florida right now as we speak, as the president is down with House Republican leadership figuring out some of the next steps. But what we can do is provide a framework, and that's what we try to do here at AmCham Canada. I have the privilege to serve, as Dave said, on his board here with AmCham, on our national board, and chair our trade committee and work with great people like Andrea Van Voot. We share a number of our clients together and the entire team at Harper. So it's at Harper in Wellington, and it's just a pleasure to be here as always. And of course, Hannah, and I'm looking forward to hear from Hannah and Andrea about what is going on in Canada right now, but the great folks at Global Public Affairs and Elizabeth by extension, who's on the board with us as well at AmCham. And Dave, I can't say enough about your leadership in AmCham over the years, in both good times and these bumpy times. But I think that just goes back to our shared Ohio roots. We're Ohio boys. I noticed as we were down last week celebrating the inauguration, whether you're Republican or Democrat, that's important for U.S. democracy. Wonderful for Ohio. Our vice president comes from our state. We are the state of presidents, including William McKinley, who's the president's favorite former president, it seems like. Our vice president, J.D. Vance, and two new U.S. senators. So it was an exciting time there, and then to be at the Canadian Embassy the next day. And then, Dave, as you and I both love watching Ohio State, our beloved Ohio State Buckeyes, win the championship. And while we were in the middle of the Natty, the president made his little announcement in response to a question by Josh Wingrove. I think that was right about the second quarter, where we're looking at February 1st. So for some of these tariffs, let's just take a step back for a moment. When we were talking about these issues in the past, back in USMCA time or CUSMA time, we were talking about this framework, and Andrea and Dave always tease me about my love of alliteration, maybe too much. But we put together a framework at the time that said, okay, here's the tone and tenor. We all got caught up in kind of Trump 1.0 and the things that were said and tearing up NAFTA. And Canada, frankly, in the early days wasn't even part of that discussion. But it just gets caught up in all of this noise, right? The tone and tenor. And unfortunately, I think if you fast forward to where we are today, it's deja vu all over again in that regard. And we can talk more about that. But for me as a trade lawyer, I was really in a Canada-US, been doing Canada-US for 25 years in North American trade. I was really focused on the targets and the topics. What's going to be for our clients the targets and topics of these discussions? Again, this is going back to 17. And then it was actually Andrea Van Voot that flagged, and Andrea came from her experience negotiating TPP and a bunch of other trade deals out there and said, the US has that fast track authority, trade promotion authority, and that has some timelines in it. We were just dealing, and I said, I don't really think that's going to play out that much. But then I went and looked at it and took a deeper dive. And what became clear is that last basket of T's, the timing and tempo of all of this. And when you overlaid the strict rules that were in that legislation that governed how we were going to negotiate USMCA, or now CUSMA, or CUSMA, USMCA, before NAFTA, of course. And when we laid that out, we said, we can't tell you what's going to happen, but we can tell you by when it must happen, right? And so the timing drove the truck. And it was the same thing when we started seeing steel and aluminum tariffs. When you looked at those statutes and national security, how that laid out. And when you looked at what became the China tariffs under Section 301, these were statutes we hadn't used in a long time, or sporadically at best. But when you started overlaying that calendar, the timing and tempo really made it, I don't want to say easy, but made it pretty obvious where the direction these negotiations were going. And I would say that's exactly where we are here. So we can talk a lot today about the tenor and tone and what's going on in Canada. Let me be very blunt. If we spend our time there, Canada-US will lose. We'll just lose. If it's all about 51st state, if we're constantly reacting to everything on Truth Social, and let's face it, this isn't about, Canada's going to lose too. And it's not about who's tougher, who's bigger, the rule of 10 times the economy, 10 times the population in Canada-US. It goes back to what Minister Freeland said at the start of the CUSMA negotiations. Nobody comes to a trade negotiation with a clean t-shirt, right? Again, I'm not endorsing you all. We had our election. You guys, you can vote for whoever you want. I'm just saying it was a great phrase. Nobody comes to a trade negotiation. Canada doesn't come to this tone and tenor discussion with a clean t-shirt. There's been a lot of things said about the United States and the Trump administration in recent months, certainly over the last 4 to 6 years, that are just as offensive, candidly, in many ways. I mean, we've kind of broken the rule that all of us live in our personal lives. When our friends tell us that they broke up with somebody, boyfriend or girlfriend, you don't say anything nasty about that person until you know that relationship's over, right? And unfortunately, political leaders in Canada and business leaders and others made that mistake because he's back. I'm not saying you can't say it. I'm not, everybody has a right, but you ran the risk. And if you don't think those folks in Washington know what has been said, and we could go on all day about this. So all of that to say, if we're going back and forth about who said what, when, we lose. Now, the important point is actually the America First trade policy memo that came out on day one. Wasn't tariffs, so everybody wiped a sigh of relief. But if we've spent countless hours now pouring through that, there were really no surprises in it, really, in what we looked at. And the framework that we have talked about in our AmCham Trade Policy Committee and that we have been talking about with our clients, and I'll quickly wrap up here, is that to think about these tariffs, this tariff threat, as it falls into 3 buckets or 3 tranches. The first tranche are what we're talking about right now with February 1st, what we have called transactional or targeted tariffs. This idea that the president wants to achieve a specific policy objective here, dealing with the border, dealing with undocumented migration, dealing with fentanyl, and will put tariffs on as a way to reach that result. They're meant to be short-term, hopefully, right? And they're meant to achieve a specific result. Just ask Colombia overnight. And when you look at the America First Trade Policy Memo, there's a list in Section 4, A through G. G, actually the very last one, is the Canada, US, Mexico one. But there's a list before that, and it includes national security tariffs on steel and aluminum, a review. So that's going to be back in the hopper. It includes outbound investment and includes a number of one-off issues. Some of those are short-term, like what we're talking about now, border tariffs, and the other are more longer terms because that review of steel and aluminum, that takes time. We know that statute. There's certain timelines in there. But keep in mind that these are these one-offs, and we saw the president, he was upset with Russia or something over the weekend. And sure enough, that's what we're going to see these pop up all the time. And all of the focus is on those. And I'll just very quickly come back. The second basket, the second tranche, are what we have called transformational or transitional tariffs. These are starting what are now called the global supplemental tariffs, right? These are the across the board 10 to 20% tariffs. The Commerce Department has been charged to put together a report by April 1st, looking at trade deficits, going to each country and saying, we have a trade deficit with you, and here's why. And that report will be done. Meanwhile, the Treasury Department will be doing a report to create the External Revenue Service to collect these tariffs. That's the issue that's out there. Those are meant to be long-term transformational tariffs where the U.S. puts a tariff on and says, until we reduce the trade deficit with your country, we'll continue these tariffs in place. Now, a lot of what you've seen in the media commingles basket 1 and 2. Because when we talk about sliding scales, will it be 10 to 20%? Will it be 3 to 5%? That's about will it be sectoral versus global? That's really talking about this. But the fact that you're talking about a comprehensive study and creating a new entity to collect the tariffs, that should be a sign these are going on. And if you've ever read Bob Lighthizer, former Ambassador Lighthizer, your U.S. Trade Representative book, if you've ever read anything coming out of American Compass, if you look at any of the reports filed by people that are now the National Economic Council, this is what they're talking about, right? The first basket is what we're all energized about in Canada, US, and retaliation and all these things. It's the second basket, because in that second basket also included a series of other reviews that are more long-term structural transformational, including accelerating USMCA. So the review of USMCA, which needs to be done by July 1st, 2026, which under US, our procedures in the US we would have started those public consultation periods in the fall of 2025. It's now. It's been accelerated to right now. And then the third basket, just to be precise, is a series of measures on China. And if there's anything coming in from China, the bottom line is that it's under extensive review, including removing permanent normal trade relations, looking at the phase 1 China deal that we had where China agreed to buy more things and do things on joint ventures, et cetera. That is all under review as we speak, due April 1. But interestingly, even in that China basket, there's a North American issue, which is part of it's being USTR is being tasked with looking at circumvention. So for example, goods coming into Mexico, like automotive, and then coming through the back door of Mexico. So those are the 3 baskets. Now, finally, where does it all end and the timing and tempo? What didn't hit me until I poured into it was we are starting right now with those transactional tariffs, right? A threat by February 1st. Will Canada's proposals be enough? Will Mexico's be enough? Or the president's going to put on tariffs? And those may be 25%. It may be like he threatened in 2019, 5% and escalating. It may be nothing, right? But at the same time, we're reviewing the USMCA CUSMA, and that process is underway. And we will be doing that while the U.S. Department of Commerce and Treasury and others are doing a report about these global supplemental tariffs. So you can easily see a scenario where the United States says, you know what, we want X, Y, Z in USMCA. And if you don't do it, we're withdrawing from USMCA and you'll get these global supplemental tariffs. Because last time, if we pulled out of USMCA, we kind of default back to what are called most favored nation tariffs, which there's different levels, but the best one is best example is it's usually 2.5%, right? And companies can eat 2.5. And that was where the US kind of didn't have leverage last time. But now we're going to say, you know what? It's not, if you don't give us what we want in USMCA, we're going to bump those up to higher, maybe 10%, 20%, whatever. And that's why the president's language about deficits is very concerning, because that's going to be the measuring stick, right? And then we can talk more as this goes on, Dave, but I clearly, that timeline, I think, is often lost in the discussion. So we're so caught up on the tone and tenor. We're so caught up on these first baskets of tariffs, which, if they are 25%, are a very significant issue, right, for many of our clients and companies. But I don't want to, others have called them a sideshow or a theater or those kind of things. They're very real. I mean, if anybody, it wasn't a surprise that the president pulled those out on Colombia over the weekend. What surprised me was how detailed the order was. The order was, using IEPA, which is a International Economic Emergency Economic Powers Act, which many of us had said they would use. And they've already put the machinery in place because they declared 2 national emergencies last week on the southern border and on energy. So they could put these tariffs on, arguably, whenever they want. But it also had removal of visa, closure of visa. I mean, they had it down, right? This group is organized this time around. So if they want to go on Feb 1, they can. But what's more potentially critical to Canada, US is that main cable, that transatlantic cable right now, right? The thing that stitches everything together, that right now, you know, the Russians and Sweden are all upset that the Chinese are cutting those cables and cutting off communication. Like our main wire, our main cable is USMCA. And that's the thing that potentially is at threat right now, along with these global tariffs. So it's really that timing, and it's now. If there's any takeaway from today, it's all happening right now. And so how that shapes Canadian politics, et cetera, Dave, I'll turn that back to the other experts on the call. But I think that's getting lost in the conversation.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Dan, for that backdrop. Super helpful, and I think it shapes the rest of our conversations. Hannah, I'm going to hand things over to you now just to talk a little bit about the state of affairs in Ottawa, what's happening at the provincial level, and how we ought to consider all of those things from a Canadian political landscape. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Dave, and thank you to the Chamber as well for having me. I really appreciate joining such esteemed panelists. So let's start there. What's the current state of affairs in Ottawa? Well, I have not seen the current state like I am seeing it right now. You mentioned off the top, I had been with CBC for the past little bit, but I've covered politics in Ottawa for the past almost 25 years. And I've covered as far back as Jean Chrétien, the Liberal Prime Minister at the time. What I'm seeing now is a very precarious situation. And it's something that the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, the current Prime Minister, sort of left Canada in. And a lot of people are extremely frustrated with that. So he stepped down, of course, most know. He stepped down as a Liberal leader. He remains Prime Minister until another leader is chosen. And right now, there are 6 people in that race. One wasn't accepted to be in the race over the weekend. But right now, I think people are saying that it is Mark Carney's to lose. Mark Carney is the former Bank of Canada governor, former Bank of England governor, and he seems to have established quite a following right across this country. So how this is going to work is the next prime minister is going to be chosen by Liberals across this country because we're not in an official election campaign. This is a leadership race. It happens on March 9th. That's when the new leader and prime minister will be chosen. And the reason for that is because of the state that the current prime minister, Justin Trudeau, left us in. So it's I think precarious is kind of a light word because what we're seeing happen in the United States, we have a government. Yes, there is still a government here. It is prorogued. So what happens is just because the House of Commons isn't sitting, the government is still working. It's still a functioning government. When we go into an election campaign, that prorogation will end and it's in caretaker mode at that point. And I'm sure we'll have a few questions about that because we could be negotiating, as we just heard from Dan, to this April 1st deadline in the midst of an election campaign. And how can a caretaker government deal with that? And Andrea is very well versed in this and coming up with deals, especially the TPP was signed just days before the 2015 election campaign in October. So currently, we are seeing this Liberal leadership race take place here in Canada. We also know, as Dan was mentioning, Chrystia Freeland, the former Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, basically the right-hand person to Justin Trudeau, threw that bomb in and decided that she wasn't going to stand by him any longer in December. And that's why everything seemed to topple after that. She made that announcement that she wasn't going to read the fall fiscal update and left Justin Trudeau kind of hanging because she told him on the phone. And we hear from reports from the Globe and Mail, Bob Fife, that the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, got that phone call in his SUV as he was about to enter Parliament. He didn't have someone to read the fall economic update that day. So there's all of that happening in the state of play in Ottawa right now. This internal race, but also in the meantime, we have Justin Trudeau and his cabinet still trying to maintain relations and figure out how to deal with these upcoming February 1st deadline. We also heard it in the Wall Street Journal today that they would be implemented on Saturday, and how to manage that. We heard from Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly earlier today, and I think this plays back to what Dan was talking about a little bit earlier. She says right now they're dealing with a couple of things. She said the executive order signed was clear, and that she says first they're looking at the study and how that relationship is being managed by April 1st because of this executive order and what Dan was talking about, trying to make sure that they aren't on the wrong side of these tariffs globally. But then she was asked about the CUSMA. And when she was talking about CUSMA, she said that they're putting their teams on it. And what I hear from Dan is that they really have to get on this because there's two types of deadlines here. The one is this Saturday and what they're going to do there. They say they're going to retaliate. They haven't put out a full list of those retaliatory measures, but it's a three-phased approach when it happens. So they're responding to this, and the cabinet is still working with the United States. But as you mentioned, Dan, Josh Wingrove, in that when the prime minister or the president was signing those executive orders, that is how our government found out the February 1st date. There hadn't been conversations with the federal government and the cabinet ministers before then to tell them, look, we're going to implement them on the 1st. So I find that extremely concerning that the federal government learned from a reporter asking a question when Donald Trump was signing his executive orders that the 25% would be implemented on February 1st. However, one of the things he did say is, I think. So this is what's happening here in Ottawa when it comes to that. And the role of the provinces in all this is really interesting too. And I would have to say that when it comes to the provinces, you see Ontario Premier Doug Ford going out there, and he really has been responding, and a lot of people are calling him Captain Canada. But then you also see Danielle Smith going out and responding, saying that they're not going to use our energy resources as a retaliatory measure. Then you hear from Manitoba making a decision on how they're going to protect the border. All of this different types of freelancing by the provinces. And I think one of the reasons for this is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in the past, up until now, hasn't had a lot of these meetings with the premiers when it comes to a potential Trump government. Last summer, for example, the federal government was sitting down with the cabinet. They were talking about how they would deal with a potential Trump government. And they didn't invite the provinces or the premiers to be involved in that discussion. Now what happens is you see all of these premiers reacting in their own way, and there's not one singular voice that has control over the narrative. And I think that's one of the biggest issues right now we're seeing in Canada, and we're hearing that from a lot of different areas, is that if you don't come out with that singular voice, you see Donald Trump down in the United States going, great, there are a lot of cracks in that government, and I'm going to attack those cracks and cause as much chaos as I can to get what I want. What exactly it is that he wants, and I think that's one of the things that the federal government is starting to focus on, is why is he implementing these tariffs, and why and when is this going to happen? And again, it comes back to what Dan was saying as well. So they really have to focus on this. They have to be at the table. They have to have these talks with the Trump administration. And you're starting to see that it's not clear if they have a handle on everything all the time. So that's what's happening in Ottawa. I'm sure there's a lot of different questions out there as well, but it's just a quick sample of how things are playing out up here. And they're just trying to keep control over everything, while on the sidelines, we have this leadership race happening for the next Liberal leader and the next prime minister.
Wow, that's a lot,
I know, it's like just trying to get it all in one thought.
Exactly. And given that backdrop, we thought it would be great to have Andrea Van Voot, who did work on TPP and served again as a trade and foreign policy advisor in the Harper administration, just to talk through like what's really happening behind the scenes right now, what options does the government have, and how do they frame these decisions and approach? So, Andrea, small task for you.
Thanks,
Easy
Dave,
peasy.
and so happy to
Sure.
be here with you and Dan and Hannah. Maybe I'll just offer a few observations that give a little bit of maybe insight as to what people are thinking about, or how the government is starting to think and how they're starting to prepare. But if I could just for a minute start with President Trump. This is a different President Trump from the first term. He is, he's had 4 years to reflect on what he would have done differently, to think over his regrets, to think of, where he lost time, to give consideration to what would have been a more effective tool against his trading partners who weren't giving him what he wants. And so as a result, you're seeing a more efficient, more effective President Trump very, very early in his term, right? This isn't the typical first few days of a presidency where everyone's trying to find their offices in the bathroom, right? They know where everything is, and they've been thinking for 4 years about what they would do differently. They know how fast this time passes. And they're getting down to business quickly. And so you see some very interesting indicators of this. The fact that the president put Secretary Letnick, who's responsible for commerce and USTR, in charge of both trade and tariff, because I think he saw that having that friction in the last administration between Wilbur Ross and Bob Lighthizer on approach was something that slowed him down and made him slightly less effective. So he's making some tactical changes, some strategic changes as well within his administration to be more efficient and effective right off the bat. I'm not particularly surprised that that the situation with Colombia unfurled the way that it did. I think it's an important learning lesson for all of us, that if you are not aligned with his agenda on things that he really cares about, that you will very quickly see the punishment, which in this situation is a very effective, very efficient 25% tariff, but also a number of other measures that will make things quite difficult for that country that's not giving President Trump what he wants. I don't think that, to Hannah's comment, and I think this is what she was foreshadowing, I don't think that the February 1st 25% tariff comment from the president, I don't think that that was an announcement. I don't think it was a decision. I don't think he was putting something out there. I think what he was doing, which is a very typical tactic of his, was to say, this is coming. It's going to be 25%. It's going to be February 1st. Could be February 2nd. Could be February 10th. Could be March 1st. I think what will determine that timing is informed by what just happened with Colombia. It's how quickly is Canada able to align itself with the United States on matters of concern for the US. So when you think a little bit about what's happening behind the scenes, the Canadian government, with all of the ways that it's hobbled, that Hannah covered very well, with all of sort of the challenges facing the federal government, they're using all of the tools at their disposal to meet with the US administration to really understand what they want, what they're looking for, what will satisfy them. Because you can kind of envision this whole process with every country in the world being, every country literally showing up on the front steps of the White House to say, okay, I brought you a present. Is this good enough? Please don't implement your tariffs. And the president saying, nope, not good enough. Go back, and here's a 5%, 10%, 20% tariff. That's not what anybody wants to be on. So the Canadian government will do everything that it can to understand with some precision as to what it is the administration's looking for. We already know some of that, right? That's, NATO 2%. It's securing the border against human smuggling, fentanyl, illegal immigration. Okay, then it comes down to USMCA. What is he really looking for with respect to USMCA? And the one thing, Dan alluded to timing. One of the things that the Canadians will have in the back of their mind is that this time the president doesn't have trade promotion authority. This means that any new trade deal that he wants to pass has to go through Congress. And so if it really does encompass massive change, though it's a little bit hard to imagine what that content would be, but if that USMCA agreement were to reflect massive change, he would have to take that through Congress. There's some changes that can be made not through Congress, or some, so here's my point, I guess. Behind the scenes, it's essential, also to Hannah's point, that we are united, we're strong, we're doing everything that we can to align ourselves to the president, because we don't really understand what's coming at us. And as negotiators, you don't want to be giving something up before you really understand what the cost is, before you really understand what your negotiating partner wants. And you don't want to be giving up any of those really sensitive things until you start to move a little bit closer to the end of those negotiations. So right now, folks are trying to learn as much as they can about how the negotiations are going to progress with the administration on whatever the list of subjects might be. And then they'll try and figure out how to make progress on aligning with the president without giving him too much. And that is where our politics is going to play into the dynamics here, which is depending on when the election is going to be, you could potentially have two new governments, right? You could have, the Trudeau government that could have one set of conversations. You could then have a Chrystia Freeland, Mark Carney government that has another set. It's not clear exactly how long that administration will last. And then you could potentially have an election and then another set of governments. My point in mentioning that is just that if I'm Trump, I'm going to try and get as much as I can out of every one of you. And I'm going to pocket everything that someone gave me right before you. And so it's important as a business community, as a policy community, that we figure out how to strengthen the Canadian government's posture in that regard and not weaken it. So not play into the president's hand and suggesting any weakness on the part of our negotiating, our eagerness or our fear, because all of these things are things that the U.S. administration looks at and says, well, your business community is saying we should open up USMCA and renegotiate right now. And that is playing directly into his hands. So we need to remember that we are negotiating against someone who is a master at this, and do everything that we can to strengthen our position. I'll hand it back over to you, Dave, with that.
Great, thanks, Andrea. Appreciate that. We've got a few questions that have come in through the Q&A function. Would again encourage everyone to keep submitting questions, and then I'll just sort of send the ones that we have out so far, and we can build from there. We have a question from Shayna Furlong, and I'll send this one to Dan. Can you help us understand the rhetoric around trade deficits being categorized as subsidies? It's hard to envision a world where Canada's smaller economy and population could reasonably match the US import demand. So I'll hand that one to you, Dan.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful whether it's talking, one is, as I laid out the tariffs at the beginning, and Hannah and Andrea both touched on this, like there's significant overlap in the coverage, right? A lot of these topics get commingled. And they get commingled by the president himself. The president doesn't come out there and speak with nuance, right? He doesn't, he's going to come out there like he's not. I'll take Greenland, for example. Like, he comes out there and talks about Greenland. He's not laying out a roadmap for, hey, there are very real issues in terms of the Arctic, right? I mean, there are very significant. There's also issues about Greenland itself and whether its population still likes the current arrangement with Denmark, right? But that's not what he says, right? He's going to come out there and say, same thing with the Panama. There's very real issues going back to China's Belt and Road with investments in port infrastructure around the world. Whether that's the Panama Canal or not, it's a different issue. But he's like, and then he'll come up with some interesting facts around that, going up again back to William McKinley. I can kind of get there with all of these, actually, if you understand the underlying issues. Not so sure I can get there with the Gulf of America, Gulf of Mexico thing. I don't get that one, frankly, in terms of a policy objective, but I get the politics of it. But in any event, so I don't think when the president's talking about subsidies versus deficits, he means like our legal definition of what a subsidy is. What he is he's got a scorecard, right? And somebody's showing him that Canada is running a surplus with the US in terms of our trade surplus. And this administration has already off the idea that there's a lot of time and energy spent in economist land and think tank world that trade deficits don't matter. They're past that. They believe that trade deficits matter. And there is a very rational argument for that laid out by Ambassador Lighthizer, by American Compass, and others. They're there. You're not going to convince them otherwise. You may convince Congress, you may convince others, but you ain't convincing this crew, right? So they believe on the scorecard with Canada. So this gets into what Hannah was touching on. So the Commerce Department is putting together a report. So the best thing that countries around the world can be doing, Canada in particular, and Canadian companies in certain sectors can be doing, is feeding into that comment process, which really hasn't been announced yet by Commerce. USTR announced a few on the China piece on Friday, but is to put in there, like, how does this deficit, what really is the Canada trade deficit? I'm not sure it's going to matter, candidly. I actually suspect the report's drafted as we speak, frankly. But it's a way to get into the process to start doing that education process. I would also encourage people, we declared a national emergency on energy. And this is to unleash what the president did on energy isn't getting a ton of attention, but other than outside of the EV subsidies, but a lot of the permitting process and others, building new refining capacity, speeding up pipeline infrastructure. Well, you know who does a lot of that for the United States? Canada. So, and that report's actually happening faster than the other report. So I would get in there right now and start educating people at DOE and some of the more friendlier agencies in the US government to say, hey, if you want to achieve those energy objectives, here's what you have to do with our Canadian, cousins as this goes forward. So, again, I appreciate the question, but let's not get into the specifics of subsidies versus deficits. That's not how they think. In the advisors and the expertise, absolutely they do. President, it's a scorecard. We have a deficit with Canada, and guess what? You're not paying up on NATO, and and we always forget this one. And the president doesn't talk about it, but we can tell you we hear about it all the time. When I was president, remember you told us we're in this together on the border. We're in this together. How about when that first real threat after 9/11 hit COVID, and you guys closed the border yourselves, and you didn't let Americans in? You think they forgot about that? No, they didn't. So those are those issues, which makes that border argument, we're in this together, a little bit challenging at this point, with now that these folks, to my earlier comment, are back,
Can I
right?
jump-
And so,
sorry.
Go ahead, please. No, I'm done.
Sorry, Dan, I just wanted to jump in there. And one of the questions that I don't know, I would have sitting on this side of the border is you do see, although it's a lot of freelancing right across this country from the premiers, but they are addressing, well, the federal government gave $1.3 billion, although it's over 6 years to increase security at the border. You have each of the provinces. We actually had Manitoba out there today. And yes, although they're rangers that will be helping with the RCMP, it's more eyes on the border. Ontario, Alberta all came out and made announcements to, thicken that border, hopefully not economically thicken that border, but also when it comes to NATO. One of the things we heard from the defense minister over the weekend is that they're now pushing that timeline up to get to that 2% of GDP by 2027. Are these types of things that might, and sorry, I'm asking a question there, but Dan, I'm just so intrigued by your insights on this too, that might, make the administration go, okay, they are doing what we asked them to do. And when it comes to fentanyl, let's be frank, it's 1% of the fentanyl across the border. And was anybody in the United States paying attention to the big cocaine bust that happened in Ontario last week, where it was the largest one that Toronto police have ever busted? And that cocaine came from Mexico all the way through the United States and into Canada. So if you start to put that bit of information out there, is this where the administration might go, or are they just kind of dug in?
Yeah, I think it starts from a position. This is just my take on it.
Yeah,
This
for
is
sure.
a complete personal view on it. I would say I think they start from a position of being dug in and then convince us otherwise, right? I will say when we saw these busts of the cartel in Mexico and we saw the bust in BC, the reaction of your average American, and I certainly don't speak for my fellow country folks, but is, why wasn't that happening already? Right now, you can easily point back and you guys got a lot of problems in your country too, meaning the United States, right? But I think it's actually fitting in, oh, look at what the president did. He got them to act. I do think though, what we are hearing from, and it just depends on if it's getting to the right individuals within the administration is that, and that right individual is the guy at the top, right?
Mhm.
At the end of the day, somebody has to convince him, because he's not only the decider, he's the messenger, right? Is that Canada's proposals on the border seem to be working, that the Canada's proposals, or excuse me, Mexico's proposals, they're on the border, particularly remain in Mexico, which we saw kind of come into effect last week. Those are all very important steps toward progress. The question is it going to be enough over the next week? Our understanding is the president still wants to, and his team still want to see some steps. We don't know. We kind of know some of the things on Mexico taking more aggressive action on cartels and things of that nature. We on Canada, it's not quite clear what they want. And I think that's going to be where the challenge is. How much more can Canada give? But there may be a way to get past this February 1st, but I don't think it changes the dynamics for one. I don't think they'll remove the threat. The threat will stay there. Like, oh, we'll keep this on. But then we're going to be in these other lanes that, quite candidly, to me, for our clients and Canada US business community, are of greater significance. USMCA, global supplemental tariffs, those types of things, those have the potential to move the needle. And whether it's Wall Street or Bay Street or anywhere around the world that kind of took a sigh of relief last week, it's almost comical, right? It's a replay of the last time where the street's saying, hey, wow, he pulled back and didn't do it on day one. He's going to do it. The global supplemental tariffs are happening.
That's a date to keep in mind. The April 1st is pretty.
Well, and I think April 1st, and I want to just nuance this
Sorry,
for just
Andrea.
a moment. I saw Andrea, you're jumping in. But a lot of what's happening, what I would be watching and what we are watching, is the reconciliation bill discussion. This gets into a lot of inside baseball. It's being decided as we speak down at Doral. But whether we have one bill or two bills, and because the global supplemental tariffs are the revenue piece for the tax cuts. And if the tax cuts are kicked into a second bill that happens much later in the fall, that gives more runway for the global supplemental tariffs. To me, the two most concerned, but if we do it in one bill, that the speaker thinks it'll be April, that's pretty optimistic. But it would be in late Q2, maybe early Q3, global supplemental, because those are linked. The tax cut, the financial bills, and the tariffs, because you have to generate revenue to offset those tax cuts. And other spending cuts, no tax on tips, and all the other things the president's promised, which will likely get left in the jet wash. So there's a lot of the timing, but the key is to get into that debate now, which is happening as we speak. That kind of analysis is happening at the moment. To me, the most concerning things around tariffs, if you're somebody that doesn't want to see tariffs on, are the president's just fixation on deficit, particularly with Canada, and the fact that tariffs generate revenue. I mean, like, those are, that's how he sees it. It's going to fill the coffers, and we'll see how long that lasts.
Dave, let's just go on to the next question.
I was going to say, Andrew, I was going to throw the next one to you. We sort of touched on this, but I think people want a little more clarity. So why can't Team Canada simply focus on the U.S. administration ask and basically ensure tariffs, no tariffs by securing the border, increasing police action on fentanyl, act as a G7 country, 2% NATO, et cetera, versus the dollar for dollar retaliation that we're hearing a lot about.
So up until just the very end of that conversation, that question, I would say we are. Right, government's trying to take some steps to address both security at the border, but also the NATO 2%. I am concerned it's not going to be fast enough for President Trump, but they're trying to show some movement. But when you get to the last part of the question, the reason why you start talking about retaliation is because you need to suggest to your domestic industry that you're willing to stick up for yourself if the president does implement the tariffs, right? What we saw over the weekend with Colombia, they refused the return of Colombian citizens to Colombia. President implemented the 25% tariff plus a number of other measures that were quite painful. And the Colombian president sent his plane, right, to go pick them up. Anyways, what Canada's saying is like, we're not just going to cave if you implement the 25%. We are going to retaliate. Sure. Okay. The Canadian business community doesn't have a heck of a lot of patience, I think, for the imposition of tariffs against President Trump. So there will be pressure to go in and fix this. And I actually think that that ties into what Hannah and Dan were talking about a minute ago, which is, let's use that example of the cocaine bust in Canada, cocaine coming up, from Mexico through the United States to Canada. One of the tactics that the Canadian government can and should use is, wow, President Trump, we really have a problem with Mexico. You and I, we have a problem with Mexico. We really have a problem with China. And that's not something that we did in the first term. But aligning with the president and appearing as though we are a partner of his in trying to solve some of the big problems facing his country are, I think, the ways that we avoid the imposition of tariffs most effectively for as long as we possibly can. I don't think we're going to see the imposition of tariffs on February 1st. I know the minute I say that I will be wrong, but I really don't.
This is being recorded, Angela.
I think there'll be another date. I think another date. I think there'll be another number. I think it could go up. I think it could go down. He could just not say anything. Doesn't matter. He can roll out another threat that will be just as concerning to the business community. But I just want to emphasize that doesn't mean he won't. I absolutely believe he is serious about imposing tariffs. I'm just not convinced it will be February 1st. Could be February 2nd. It could be April 3rd. I just think that date could move.
Fair. You got it after this a little bit, Andrea, but I think this one is really a good question for Dan, which this comes from Barry Wright. When looking at USMCA, is there a real motivation in Canada to go to a binational agreement, basically a USCA, and leave Mexico out of a future agreement?
My answer is very short. First of all, that would be a disaster. North America works because it's all three countries, right? The economic incentive to do a deal is all three countries, right? Is we become, both the United States and Canada become more competitive by having Mexico in there as well as part of it. So, but there, and I've said this since the statements were made earlier this fall, that there's a difference between having two separate deals and then dealing with our issues in two separate ways. What I mean by that, you could have one deal, but work at two speeds, right? And to Andrea's point, and I'll let whatever the Canadian politics of that are, is that, Canada, Mexico, I think the US was genuinely surprised the first time around that Canada didn't lock arms with the United States and say, let's deal with China, let's deal with Mexico together, because this is good for our industry. Now, Canada, particularly on the auto rules, eventually came around on that. But and I think here, but that doesn't mean you say we don't have a deal, and particularly since we have an existing deal right now, right? You wouldn't break that apart. What you would do is say, now let's talk about how to address these issues with Mexico. And look, that's kind of what happened last time in the auto rules. The Mexicans haven't forgot that either, that they kind of got thrown under the bus there. And so you do see, if you follow Mexico negotiations and politics, they're pointing fingers at the Canadians a lot in certain sectors, because there still is some memories of that time in those negotiations. But I think there's a distinction there between two speeds versus two deals is how I would suggest, would break those apart.
That makes sense. We've got a couple of questions here around China. Trump seems to be softening on China with respect to tariffs. Is it correct to assume the influence of Tim Cook, Elon Musk, Bezos, etc.? And why is the calculation on deficits not as it's highlighted as it is with Canada and other countries right now? So maybe Dan will go to you there on that one as well, and then we're gonna jump into some others.
I'll just say, I don't agree with the premise, right? I don't think the president has softened on China. I think it's going to be a ratchet effect, but there's the basic reality that China is a very difficult set of issues to deal with that transcend trade, right? And one of the ways you can deal with China is if you build, first of all, make sure the backyard's in the right place. We're going to have to deal with Europe as well, and deal with the rest of the Americas, you know, where we do have leverage. That was the whole point, right? The whole point the last time around was not to bring, like, what, notwithstanding what the president said, the idea behind the trade strategy was not that these jobs would all leave China, these plants, and come back to the United States or Canada. That wasn't going to happen. They were going to go to Vietnam. They were going to go to Mexico. They were going to go to other countries around the world, but we have more leverage on those countries, including with, we're probably not going to war with those countries over Taiwan or places like that if these things happen, right? So, but I do think the president is also, to Andrea's earlier point, I think that's a fantastic point of, this is their second time around. The president doesn't have a chance, at least hopefully, under our current system, he doesn't have a chance to stay on past this term. So he's thinking about legacy too, and having a master deal with China is I think part of that legacy. There's a lot of talk that he wants a peace prize. There's a lot of people out there talking about that within the administration. So, you know, that's, I think, I don't believe that we've softened. I think you'll see it ratchet up. And look, the fact that China's in a much weaker position, arguably, than they were last time when this started is another issue as well. And he's got all the political support for it. You know, it's not like the view last time around where you still had a lot of kind of, hey, we can't go too hard on China. That has swung 180 since that time. So I think there's some other factors we'll actually see a ratcheting up. But he wants a deal. There's no question about that. He wants a deal with China for legacy purposes.
Dave, may I just jump in quickly on this? I think the other thing, and you know, this is a bit of a tacky comment to make, but China is the second largest holder of US debt. Like, this is a dynamic that it's like Russia being, one of the largest providers of energy to Germany, and this is playing a role of some sort that speaks to why the president needs to reassert the United States economic independence. They need to get their books in order. They need to deal with some of these external influences, because it's really hard to hold a country to account when they have a much bigger hammer. And it's also why it's smart to work through your trade partners to help close some of those, forgive me for using the word backdoor, some of those, that backdoor access that some, challenging shippers, traders, exporters have to the United States. Is it's a way to bring some friends to the fight. But, these all play a role in the president's calculation of how he can leverage China.
Have a question from Kyle Gingras. With Canada hosting the G7 summit and having President Trump attending alongside Canada, between prime ministers, how will the leadership impact Canada's role and Canada's ability to navigate discussions during the summit and then also going forward? And I think, Hannah, maybe you could speak to that, and we'll go to Andrea.
Yeah, Kyle, thanks for the question. When the G7 summit comes up in the summertime in Kananaskis, it will be interesting to see who our leader will be. First off, we know it's not Justin Trudeau. It is either going to be, right at this point, Chrystia Freeland or Mark Carney, or if we've gone into an election campaign, and there are a lot of ifs on this, is it going to be a conservative government with Pierre Poilievre? So you look at the relationship, I would say like three of those potentials may have with Donald Trump. Chrystia Freeland, she's made it clear that she feels that she stood up to him last time and would successfully be the right person to put in place this time around, in particular in dealing with him on these types of issues and other issues, playing hardball. Mark Carney's been a little bit more diplomatic, I would say, on the approach to Donald Trump. And I think that's something that is a smart move, because he's a sensitive guy. Donald Trump is a sensitive guy. He does not like to be called names. He notices it and he will call them back. We saw that the last time he was in Canada and going directly after Justin Trudeau after he made a comment. So I think Mark Carney is doing that tactic. And when it comes to Pierre Poilievre, I would say it's probably the same thing. He has been more diplomatic. They have all said that they would do tit for tat dollar per dollar tariffs if these are implemented. But I think it's in how you handle the president at this time. And this is something that really Dan mentioned off at the top, is that he's pretty sensitive to Justin Trudeau. We saw that in the trolling afterwards and calling him the governor. And that was all a tactic, just distract, get him off, the discussion points. I don't really think he wants to have conversations with Justin Trudeau. And that clearly shows on how we found out about the February 1st, 25% when he was getting asked by a reporter. And I think that's how the government found out as well. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, Kyle, but it's more on the fact that those are how all of those three potential leaders who could potentially be our prime minister at that point in time would manage a Trump administration.
Maybe this might be a little bit nerdy, so forgive me, I'll try and keep it short. So, the G7 is supposed to be, and I know a little bit about this because I was in PMO when we did the G8 at the time and G20. In Canada, there's a whole Sherpa office, right, that's negotiating with all of the other partners on what's going to be in the leaders' communique. All of that's happening. I suspect, a Mark Carney government will make some tweaks to it. If there's a Pierre Poilievre government, I think, that thing gets torn up a fair bit. I think because of all of the political upheaval that you're going to see in Canada, you'll see less of a central G7 agenda and more of a bilateral agenda based on the foundation of the G7 members. Just because I think it's going to be hard to sort of come together with that cohesive agenda in the absence of strong Canadian leadership on some key items. What do I expect to see in there, though? Russia, Ukraine, tempered by, some of the other partners in the G7, though. Russia, Ukraine, the fight against fentanyl in China, situation in the Middle East. You'll see some of that, but even those items, it's going to get hard to put all of the G7 countries on one agenda. And in the absence of strong Canadian leadership, even harder. So it's going to be a very curious G7 given the uncertainty in our political dynamics.
It's the clock now. It is 2:58. I don't know if each of you just had a kind of parting thought, and then we'll close things out. We'll start with Andrea, maybe. Anything you want the group to take away?
I would just say, folks, expect the unexpected. That plays into President Trump's hands. Expect more tariff threats, expect new dates to come up, expect moving goalposts on the border, on the NATO 2%, on other things that may come up in the context of trade. But just do the Canadian government a favor and don't inadvertently weaken their hand. Because right now it's important that we appear as strong and as capable in the negotiations, because that matters to Donald Trump just as much as Hannah's right. Not offending him matters.
Hannah?
I think with everything we're hearing, I'm going to go back to what Andrea said too. You hear a lot of different topics coming from Donald Trump. Every 2 minutes I'm watching TV and it's a different issue. Don't react to every issue. And for business leaders in particular, you should still be engaged with the political leaders, with the departments, because if you have issues, you want to make sure you're on the agenda. One of the best quotes I've heard recently is that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So I'm going to reuse that one multiple times. So make sure you're out there having these discussions, but don't react to everything. Just make sure that you're in the discussion so that everybody is aligned and the political leaders essentially know what you want out of all of these discussions.
Right. And Dan?
Yeah, I would agree 100%. I think, look, I think we have to engage this who's tougher argument isn't getting us anywhere, right? And everybody trying to flex on social media and every trade organization, everybody trying to mark their territory. it's not, it's been counterproductive at best, to say the least. And, you know, all of the comments that were made, I would agree with. I would also add, you know, we have our own politics here in the United States. So the president's enjoyed a nice week. It's probably going to go on for another week, but he's going to have some bumpy confirmation hearings. There's going to be the reality of working with a House that's decided by 2 or 3 votes is going to set in here pretty quick. So all of that means stay engaged, but we are in for the long haul here. It's going to move fast, but it's going to be, if anybody thinks this is going to be over after February 1st or April 1st, this is going to take some time. So now's the time to get engaged and start marking those, all of those points. Get at the table, mark your lanes, etc., and start moving forward. But it'll move at the quick step, but we're going to be doing this for a while, to Andrew's earlier point.
That's a great way to wrap up. And again, we're up against time, but you know, here at the American Chamber of Commerce, we're here to help. Stay in touch with us. We'll try to put sessions like this out to stay in front of things as much as we can. But in the meantime, don't hesitate to reach out and engage. And we look forward to it. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.